Well, good morning. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very thankful for the invitation, and this is a great venue, and I'm sorry that I missed the first day yesterday. I just arrived last night, but I'm looking forward to 2 exciting days, and don't know what to expect, to be precise, but it's very promising. As you already heard, I'm a media engineer, and I studied communication science and art history, and since a couple of years I'm working as an architectural historian at university. So I do research in architectural history. I'm concerned with architectural heritage, with heritage theory. I think about old buildings. I'm in a project. We try to implement artificial intelligence in architectural history research. And I also do a lot with water-related heritage. When Lisa invited me, she also asked me what I want to talk about, and it's actually pretty difficult. If there's a symposium and it's about the merger of art and science, and usually I'm speaking at scientific conferences on very specific topics, which might be very boring for most of you. I struggled to deal with this freedom. I didn't find it very easy. But then she mentioned this topic, Earth, and Miyamoto Musashi. And then, of course, this clicked and made a connection. Like 12 years ago, I studied in Japan, in Tokyo. And there I was very interested, of course, in Japanese architecture and Japanese art, but also the culture and the literature. And I read this book like 12 years ago, the Five Rings. And back then, it didn't make much sense to me, to be honest. I found it a very fascinating but difficult book. I don't know if you know it, if you're familiar with it. It's a rather short book, and now I read it again. And I again have this very ambiguous feeling that this is an interesting but a very difficult book, a book that really you have to engage with, and you have to make your own sense out of that book. So I thought, okay, I don't want to bore you with architectural history or too much with my research, and I thought I will do the following. Like sometimes you read a book of short stories, and you read a lot about, or you read different stories which seem to be disconnected from each other, but then they have a combining element. I tried to do a little bit the same. I want to talk about various things, and my connecting point is Earth in the widest sense. So I will talk a lot about Musashi, about the book, about his work, and then switch to architecture, and in the end come to some two projects I'm involved with, so to let you see what I'm doing actually right now. I want to start with Musashi. I don't know, are you familiar with Miyamoto Musashi? Whoever read the book of him or was really... Okay. So there's some basic knowledge in the room. Okay. I want to ask first, who was this Miyamoto Musashi? So yeah, he inspired at least the new 5-year cycle with the 5 elements. Musashi lived from 1584 to 1645, and he was a Japanese swordsman, a philosopher, a strategist, a writer, also an artist. He was engaged in ink painting and calligraphy, but most of all he was a ronin. Ronin means drifter or wanderer. Back then, samurai, fighters in Japan, they were engaged, so they served a lord, they had an employment in that sense, they were working as a samurai, which was a very honorable position. But there were samurai without employment, and these people were called ronin. And even nowadays, this term is used for salarymen in Japan who are unemployed, also for students who failed the entrance exam at the university and have to wait another year for the next entrance exam, and they are called ronin, drifter or wanderer. Japan around 1600 came out of a phase of almost 4 centuries of internal strife. So between Japan nowadays has still the oldest monarchy in the world, but in between the end of the 12th century and the end of the 19th century, Japan was a military dictatorship. It was led by the shogun, and the Tenno, the Japanese king, was more a representative figure until the Meiji Restoration, 1868, when he was reinstated and Japan became a monarchy again. So the 4 centuries before 1600 were characterized by a lot of warfare, by rivalry, by internal strife, and of course all the lords needed a lot of warriors, a lot of samurai. But when Musashi grew up, the times were changing, and 2 lords, Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and later the shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, they managed to stabilize the country. They brought peace to Japan, and then until the Meiji Restoration, this was a period of stability, of calm. That also means that you don't need so many warriors anymore. You don't need all these swordsmen and these samurai, but this was the time when Musashi grew up, and he was very fascinated by fighting, by sword fight, and so it happens that he became this ronin, this wanderer, the person who drifted around, who walked around looking for fights and duels and to test his skills. He became very famous of course, for his book of the 5 rings, but also for very unusual techniques like throwing a sword in a fight, and most of all for very unique double-bladed swordmanship. So samurai at this time had 2 different kinds of sword, wearing together a longer one and a shorter one. And usually, for example, the katana, the long sword, you operated this with both hands in a fight, and Musashi changed this. He said you should make use of your both hands, using both weapons at the same time. And in his book, he wrote, students of the Ichi school way of strategy, so this is their own school that he founded, they should train from the start with a sword and long sword in either hand. This is the truth. When you sacrifice your life, you must make fullest use of your weaponry. It is false not to do so and to die with a weapon yet undrawn. So what he says is you should engage in a situation with all your abilities, with all your capability. You should not focus on one single skill, and then if the situation changes, you should focus on another skill. No, you should use everything you can right from the start, because in his profession, it was about his life. It was, you only lose once, yeah? So this made him very aware of always giving 150%. Musashi engaged in 61 duels during his lifetime, 61 sword fights, and he remains undefeated. So at the age of 29, he fought his last fight, and in his book he writes then when he was 29, he kind of retired from these duels, and he did other things in his life, and also he reflected on his way as a fighter. He's considered as a kensai, which means a sword saint in Japan. He was the one who brought this profession, let's say, to absolute mastery. So he still is considered as one of the most skillful fighters, samurai in that sense, ronin, that existed. Musashi's parents died presumably pretty young. It's not much known about his childhood, but he grew up at an uncle. And this uncle taught him in Buddhism, reading, writing, painting, and also in some fighting techniques. And he must have been very, very good and very wild and fierce and fascinated by fighting. So at the age of 13, so still a boy, he engaged in his first duel. So he applied and was granted permission to fight against the samurai, which was coming through town. So there we don't have protocols of these fights, and I'm absolutely not interested in martial arts at all, but I find this fascinating that he was so young and he just wanted to sacrifice his life, and he was a winner in this first fight, and then it continued for 15 years. Then 2 years later, at the age of 15, he left his village and he started his warrior's quest and pilgrimage, wandering around, going to different fighting schools, learning new techniques, engaging in fights, perfecting his skills. When he was 29, he engaged in his last fight, and this is maybe the most famous one. He fought against Sasaki Kojiro on 13 April 1612. Kojiro was a very famous samurai, and again, like in his first fight, Musashi applied and asked for permission for this duel. And he was granted permission, and it was said, okay, the next morning at 8 o'clock in the morning, you meet at a nearby island, and there you will have the duel, you engage in fighting. What happened was the following. At night, Musashi left his house, and this already created a rumor. People thought he became afraid, and he went away, and he don't want to engage in this fight. And the next morning, at 8, at this island, Kojiro was there alone. There was no Musashi. And people found him sleeping at 8 o'clock in his bed. And of course, Kojiro, he got very upset. This was very unfriendly, impolite, to be late. And on the way to that island, Musashi took a knife on the boat and he took one of these spare rudders and he carved a sword out of this rudder, a wooden sword. Then he arrived at the island, Kojiro already out of his mind, angry and fierce about his late appearance and about all the rumors that created at night and about his unusual weapon. And he drew his sword, so this is how it is described at least. I cannot be sure about this. But then he threw his scabbard, the envelope of the sword, he threw it into the sea. And Musashi said, okay, in your mind you already lost, because otherwise you would need this scabbard again to put your sword back after you won the fight. And then the fight itself was very, very quickly. Kojiro got killed by a strong blow of this wooden sword, and Musashi won, and then he left. And this, for me, tells us a lot about what he understands as strategy. So the first thing was, at this point in his life, he was so good in sword fighting that he overcame this weapon. He was not in need anymore, because his strategy was so perfect that he could make use of a very minor thing like this wooden rudder. And the other thing is, at night already, he was leaving his house to create some rumor to make his opponent feeling superior, etc. He appeared late at the fighting spot to create anger, to bring his opponent out of his mind. And he insulted his opponent with this, what he was saying when he threw the scabbard into the sea. And this tells us, or at least tells me, that strategy is understood differently for him. It's not the mastership of that weapon, it's everything around it. You should make use of everything you can just to destroy your opponent, to destroy him mentally, to make him upset, just to win that fight. And then, for example, there's a quote in his book. He says, "The way of the Ichi school is the spirit of winning, whatever the weapon and whatever its size." So this is almost trivial, the spirit of winning. Of course, every strategy is about the spirit of winning. But he means it. He means you should consider everything around you, everything you can do to engage, to win, to be successful. And this is maybe something why this book is also nowadays very popular among businessmen, among all kind of strategists. We don't have so many sword fighters in the world anymore, but this book is still very, very popular and very well received. This was his last fight, or his last duel, and later Musashi worked for different lords. He engaged in travels and in war activity again. And he also helped to construct a castle, Akashi Castle, and he helped planning the town of Himeji. And this brings him a little bit closer to my profession, to architecture. And he also refers to architecture in his book, in the Book of the Five Rings. I talk about this soon. In 1633, Musashi began staying with Hosokawa Tadatoshi at this castle, Kumamoto. He stayed there for 10 years at this court, and 2 years before his death, he retired to a nearby cave. So the last year of his life he spent in this cave, and this is also the place he had a disciple who assisted him, and at this cave he also wrote the Book of the Five Rings. And it is believed that he died from lung cancer, but this is, of course, not certain. It was in 1643. Later, Musashi became a legend. You see this early 19th century woodblock print. He engaged in a fictional fight with a whale. This is just legend, of course, but yeah, you have this heroic figure, and afterwards history turns it into something that never existed. And Victor Harris, one of the translators of the Book of Five Rings, he wrote and he refers to the fact that usually you see Musashi with very wild hair, uncombed, in a kind of, depicted in a strange way. And this is because samurai, they had this shaved head and the hair not, but this was also a sign of honor, and he was, as a Ronin, he could not dress or have this hairstyle, so he just did not care. He left his hair uncombed, and Victor Harris puts it into these words, quote, "Concerned only with perfecting his skill, he lived as men need to live, wandering over Japan, soaked by the cold winds of winter, not dressing his hair, not taking a wife, nor following any profession save his study. It is said he never entered a bathtub lest he was caught unawares without a weapon, and that his appearance was uncouth and wretched." So he creates this legend of that man that doesn't care about anything and is just concerned with his way, with his sword fighting, with his strategy, and nothing else matters. Okay, let's come to Earth. I would like to talk about this chapter in his book, in the Gorin no Sho, in the book of the Five Rings. This book is, it's a very important book also for Kendo. This is the Japanese sword fighting or way of sword fighting. Do means way. You find this in many Japanese words for specific skills. And Do, this way idea, this contains not only a technique, but also the philosophy, a lifestyle behind it, the way how we achieve experience, how we go through things. And for the Kendo, Gorin no Sho, the Book of the Five Rings is a very important book. And it's specific because it deals with fighting techniques, with strategy, but also with warfare at once. So, for example, Musashi says if you can defeat one person, you can also defeat 10 person, and if you can defeat 10 person, you can defeat a whole army. So it does not distinguish very much between strategies for single person and for whole battlefields. And this is a surprisingly short book, so in the English translation it has just like 50 pages, so it's not a big volume. You can read it very quickly, but it's, as I said, at least I find it's very difficult to make sense of it. So you find some things in the book that seem to be very, very trivial. Sometimes you say, if you want to become perfect in strategy, you have to read this book. But it's nothing that you really, where I would say, okay, I have to do this and this, and then I get really, really good in strategy. But after a while, I thought, okay, you really have to make your own sense out of it. You can adapt the book, the chapters of the book, to the situation you're in, to your own field, to your profession, maybe. Japanese language can be very ambiguous. There are a lot of homonyms in Japanese language, and this gets worse, or say more extreme in the translation. So if you read this in English or maybe in Finnish, this is even more ambiguous maybe than in Japanese, and it doesn't really catch what Musashi was trying to say. But still, it's not a very clear or easy book, at least in my mind. It contains of an introduction. It's just one page, and then you have the 5 chapters. And the 5 chapters go along the... this is the book, sorry. These are the 5 rows, and then the 5 chapters go along the 5 elements of the Buddhist philosophy. So we have the Go-Dai, the 5 grades. These are the 5 elements that make the cosmos, and I'm sure you're aware of this. You know these things: earth, water, fire, and void. And in the European tradition, or in the ancient European, say, alchemy or philosophy, cosmology, we also have the same elements, but we don't have the void, just water, fire, earth, and air. And looking at these symbols, I was not aware of these symbols, but then just now a little side story. Have you ever seen something like this? I don't even know the English word, but if you go to old cities, sometimes outside of a shoemaker shop or a brewery or so, you have these metal signs hanging above the street. I don't know how this is called in English. And I always wondered that if you pass a restaurant or a bar or a brewery, you see this Star of David. And I never could make sense of it. I was always asking, what is the connection between the Star of David and the brewery? But then, of course, if you take fire and water and combine it, and you lay it over, so you got the Star of David, and it stands for the fire water, because they serve alcohol. So just as a side story. And so we have the Go-Dai, the 5 grades. These are these 5 elements, and then we also have the Go-Rin, and Musashi named his book Gorin no Sho, the 5 rings of Buddhism. The 5 rings of Buddhism, something else. This is the head. These are the elbows, the arms, and the both knees, or the legs. So it's interesting that he first refers to the body in the title, but then in the book he takes these other 5 elements, the ones that are here. Just see the next. If you go to a temple in Japan or so, you sometimes see these stone lanterns, and these stone lanterns they represent the 5 elements. So the big block is earth. This fur stands for water. Then you go up, you have fire, wind, and at the top you have void. So you see this very often. This is, of course, a symbol of cosmology of the whole of the earth. Earth, this element, stands for, or it represents the hard, the solid objects of the earth. And most simple idea is a stone. It's just a hard, solid object. These objects are resistant to movement and to change, in the human body, it stands for the bones, for the tissue, for our physicality. And also on a mental level for stubbornness, collectivity, and stability. And of course, this is very, very important for human beings. We have a desire to keep things as they are. There needs to be something resistant to change, because otherwise we could never build trust. If you would change constantly, if you would be a completely different person tomorrow, I could never trust you. And as a society, we could not trust each other. So this stability in our way we behave or so, in our mental appearance is something that is very, very important for engaging with each other. The other four elements are a little bit different. Water stands for the liquid, flowing, and formless things, for plants, for body fluids, for adaptation and change. Fire for energetic, powerful, moving things like animals, and it's connected with the metabolism, with body heat, with drive and passion. The wind is about things that grow and expand, like air and smoke. It's about our ability to learn about processes associated with breathing, and it stands for open-mindedness. And the last one, void, represents the things that are beyond our experience. It's pure energy, spirit, thinking, creative energy, spontaneity, and inventiveness. Musashi applies these 5 elements to his book, to these 5 chapters, and it's very difficult to make connections between what the elements stand for and what he wants to express in these chapters. For example, in the first one, the earth, it's like the ground book, the basis. We find this sentence, and he refers to this chapter and says, like a straight road mapped out in the ground. So this first chapter describes the basis of strategy, and in his mind, this is a very straight map, and you can follow this, and you got a basis idea, but I doubt that, I don't see that. And strangely, he provides a kind of an overview on his book, but not in his introduction, but in the first chapter. It's also a very strange logic, at least to me, how to set up a book. The Book of Water is about basically that you should know everything, that you should consider everything for your strategy. The Book of Fire is about how to engage in battles. The Book of Wind is about traditions and other fighting schools. Musashi says you should know the others, or we have to know the others to be able to know ourselves. So he describes other ways of fighting, their disadvantages, and points out the superiority of his own teaching. In void, in his eyes, represents the true way according to nature. If you don't want to read the whole book, you can read the Book of Void. It's just 1 page, and you can see if you can connect to the true way according to nature by reading this chapter. Maybe it makes you want to read the other books as well. This is just I leave this with you. These are just some how can I say, tips, what you should do to engage in a strategy. And you can see already that some things are obvious, some things are trivial, some things, it's a strange mixture in my eyes, but maybe this is also because we are thinking about different things, and suddenly it always needs someone to express it first and to write it down first. And maybe things like the way it's training is obvious for us, but maybe Musashi was the first who ever put it to paper, and this is why it seems obvious for us, because we know it since so many centuries. But back then, around 1600 or 643, maybe no one ever wrote it down before. The first sentence of the Book of Earth is, strategy is the craft of the warrior. So it talks about different professions. For example, a painter needs to know about brushes, about ink, about how quickly ink dries on paper. And he says, for a warrior, it is strategy. This term strategy stands for all the skills, the fighting skills and the mindset of the warrior. And his goal is, or the goal of his teaching is to let his pupils achieve mastery. It's about mastery. It's about the complete knowledge, everything that you can know and do and experience about something. He criticizes other schools. He condemns what he calls the sale of art. He says there are fighting schools, they just sell trainings, and people talk about famous schools, and they go to other schools and they just add skills without ever really achieving mastership. And I found this interesting that we talk about a commercialized world nowadays and things are changing, but 400 years ago it was pretty much the same. People had the same concerns maybe. They were talking about like authentic skills and techniques, and on the other hand, the commercial side where everything is just for sale and people run around, spend their money and achieve little things without ever arriving somewhere. Then he talks about the layers of Japanese culture back then. He says there are 4 ways in which men pass through life. As gentlemen, this means warrior, fighter, farmers, artisans, and merchants. So these were the 4 layers of the Japanese society, and they were the burakumin, the outcast, people who dealt with death or with raw meat, etc. But within these 4 layers, the warrior was in the highest level. And what is interesting for me in his chapter of Earth, that he makes a comparison between the gentleman, the warrior, and the artisan, and specifically here the carpenter. Now for us, or for most of us, a carpenter is someone who builds the wooden structure of a roof. But in Japan, until the end of the 19th century, every building, except of bridges and fortification walls, was completely made of wood. So the carpenter was the architect. The carpenter was the one who built the whole house. Everything in this house, except the tiles for the roof and the plinth is made of wood. And he compares the knowledge and the skills of the architect to the knowledge and the skills of the fighter, of the warrior. He says, for example, the carpenter uses a master plan of the building, and the way of strategy is similar in that there's a plan of campaign. And he says there's different knowledge is necessary for the carpenter, for the architect. He has to know about the nature, about the country, about the local culture, and also about the type of houses, about temples, about representative buildings, about simple buildings of housing. So you have to achieve a lot of knowledge in different fields to create mastership. And also knowledge on material. For example, he says we have straight unknotted timber, straight timber with small knots, timber of the finest appearance, even if a little weak, good strong timber, though it be gnarled and knotted, timber which is weak or knotted throughout. But you can make use of all of these types of wood. If you need a strong beam that is not visible later, but it supports the whole house, it needs to be a powerful piece of wood, but it doesn't matter if it has a nice appearance. If you want to make a cladding on a wall, you need a very refined, beautiful piece of wood. But it doesn't matter if this piece of wood is very strong. And the same about the people you work with. The knowledge about your workers is important. According to their ability, their skills and spirits. And you don't need the best man for all tasks. If someone is not very good in what he's doing, he could do something else or serve other people. So he refers these abilities and techniques of an architect to a fighter, to a warrior. So you don't only need the best people and the best techniques. No, you have a lot of variety of things. If you combine this cleverly, you can make very effective, very good use of everything you have. So you should also respect the things that seem to be of minor value at first sight. And then finally he says, like a trooper, the carpenter sharpens his own tools. And this brings me to the tool of Musashi. So I said he was a sword fighter, and this brings me to his sword. So again, the connection to earth. The sword is made of iron ore, which is taken from inside of our earth as a raw material forged into something. Now, I'll briefly talk about a katana. A katana is maybe the most famous of among many types of Japanese swords. It's a slightly curved sword with at least 60 centimeters in length, and it is used since the end of the 14th century. I have absolutely no interest in weapons and warfare, not even in military history. Absolutely not. It never fascinated me. But 12 years ago, I was in the Tokyo National Museum, and it's a beautiful museum. You see a lot of great examples of Japanese art. You see old pottery, ink paintings, a wardrobe, etc. It's a great museum. If you're ever in Tokyo, you should go there and see many great things. And then you enter a room, and this room is full of these swords. So there's swords displayed all around. And to be honest, it really fascinated me. You look at these objects, and there's so much beauty in it. It is just a piece of steel. It is very simple. It's something you take from earth and you forge it, you refine it. You refine a piece of iron and you turn it into something that has a strange perfection. Even in my mind, the purpose is very minor. This is something made to kill someone, but it's very straightforward. If you look at it and if you think about this is made in the end of the 14th century, and you go close to it and you see a surface that is like a mirror without any imperfection, and then it has very interesting proportions, like this slight bending, the angle, how the blade turns, how it becomes sharp at the edge. So I don't know, I made a connection to these objects. I was really touched by their beauty and also by the perfection. I still don't know how they made this like 600 years ago. And it's like a clockwork, you know. Clockworks are also very refined and require a lot of mastership to make, but they are very complicated. And this word is very simple. It's just a piece of metal, but it has some beauty within it. So it's literally made from earth, from refined earth. It's tamahagana, is the name of the steel that is used for these Japanese swords. For me, it is an epitome for the connections of art and science. So as I said, the aesthetic is there's an absence of any nonsense. It is very refined. It has a very simple form, and there's also an aesthetic play with contrasts. It's a bit hard to see, but you have the blade, and then on the top left, you see a little disc between the blade and the handle. Yeah? This is called tsuba. This is just a hand guard that protects your hand. And sometimes you find examples where this tsuba is just an oddly shaped piece of metal. Sometimes it's skillfully crafted, but sometimes it has a strange shape, and it's not perfect. It's a little slightly bended. And I think this is very interesting. There's in the Japanese aesthetics, there's a principle called wabi-sabi, which refers to the imperfections. Sometimes you see pottery slightly dented, or there's pottery when it's still wet, it's being dropped from a small height, like 10, 20 centimeters. So when it falls down, it gets an imperfection, and then it's burned in the oven to create something like a grain of salt, something where your eye is resting, something that breaks the perfection. And for me, this hand god also breaks the perfection of the blade. So if you take a close look to these objects, there's a lot of things that are very cleverly done. There's a lot of aesthetic play, which is not very obvious because you don't have carvings or emerald stones on it, etc. And also on the scientific part, these objects are, they come out of a very highly complex manufacturing process. They are extremely hard and sharp. And the result is an aesthetic but deadly weapon that's highly effective and which also in its use requires a lot of skills, not only a technique, but you need to as Musashi did, you need to make use of all your creativity to be good with such a thing. And the production of these swords takes several days or weeks. So in the beginning, you have these tamahage or objects or stones, and then they're being broken into little pieces, covered with ash, melted. The ash takes out the impurities. So the first process is to purify and to make clean this iron. And then later, the broken objects are melted together. They are melted into a block of steel, and then this block of steel is being melted and folded a couple of times. Sometimes you hear this mystery that the Japanese blacksmiths are folding these irons for hundreds of times. It's not true, because it's usually between 10 and 20 times, because just think you fold something 15 times, then you already create more than 32,000 layers. And this is enough to evenly spread the carbon in the steel to make it evenly strong and hard. Then later this block is formed into a kind of a blade. It takes a couple of days and it gets like a U shape, and in the empty part of the U, and this is just one technique, a softer metal is being inserted. So it's a combination of a very hard metal for the plate and a softer metal that gives it some flexibility. And it's formed, it's welded over a couple of days to give it this blade style, and later the blade is covered in clay. And at the cutting edge, the layer of clay is very, very thin. then the whole sword is being heated and cooled down in water. And this process makes the sword or the steel very, very hard. And because of the clay is thinner at the cutting edge cools down more quickly and is getting harder than the back of the sword. So there's a lot of science into it, how to create a material that's extremely hard and sharp, but it's still flexible on the other hand. And here you can see at the top part, there's a cloudy structure called hamon. This is because this clay was attached in a specific pattern. This pattern is very specific for these blacksmiths. And later the clay is removed, and you get this sword with this hamon. Also, the slight curvature comes also from the hardening process. When it's being forged, it is straight, and the hardening gives this bending. And later the sword went into a process of sharpening, which takes about 120 hours, and it's being sharpened with different kind of stones to give it this neat appearance in the end. So why do I talk so much about a sword? Because this first was the weapon of Musashi. This is why in the end he wrote this book, because he tried to achieve mastership over this object, or with this object throughout his life. And on the other hand, it contains it is made from earth, as I said, and contains a very specific idea for me. So along with this object goes the idea of the eternal, of the indestructible. The perfect sword is just indestructible, it just breaks every other sword, it lasts forever. So there's an idea of permanence in this object. But I already said we have these 5 elements, and earth is the only one which is the only one of these 5 which seems to be durable. Wind, water, fire, the void is things that are currently changing. We cannot really touch them. They are liquid, invisible. But earth is something solid. So we believe earth to be something that remains forever. But this is just, of course, an illusion. Earth is essentially the one which changes most. That brings me to stone. So from earth we can make swords, but we can also take other aspects of earth. We can use clay, stone, bricks as a building material. So even here we have concrete made of sand, cement. The architecture is based on stone, on earth as well. And architecture is also where this idea of the permanence, of the indestructible, of the eternal, is deeply embedded in. Not only in the sense that buildings need to be stable, need to be strong, so we need a strong building material. It's very difficult to make a building out of water or of air. But also on another level, just think about pyramids, gravestones, monuments, ramparts, castles. These are all objects that contain an idea of eternity. So the pharaoh built the pyramid as a grave monument because he wanted to have this as his fame transported into eternity. It is a structure that was meant to remain forever. Have you ever seen this structure on the top right? This is a kofun. A kofun is a Japanese grave structure. They were built in between the 3rd and the 7th century, and you find a lot of these various kofuns spread over Japan. And this one on the top right is the Daisen-ryo kofun. It's 720 by 300 meters. So this is, in terms of surface, is the largest grave structure on Earth. Nowadays, if you go there, you don't see much. You just see trees. You can see it's almost flat, but it's an earthen mound. And nowadays we have trees on it. They grew over the centuries and surrounded by some water. This is also, and there's another connection to Earth, because this is the place where a human's body is decaying again. Yeah? Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, the human body becomes earth again, is buried in this earth. If you take a look at this object, we look through the same air like 1,500 years ago, and the water around it looks pretty much the same as the water 1,500 years ago. The only thing that changed is the presumably a stable thing, the earth. The mound is not as high as it used to be. There are now trees growing on it. So essentially, that what we consider as being permanent and stable is the thing that is changing the most. At these places, at these kofun, we find objects called haniwa. This is pottery, earthenware. You can, for example, they look like these, like human beings, and this is also made of earth directly, and it is a very early form of expressing creativity. You think about the oldest forms of art, I come across pottery and cave painting. So this is very, very connected to this material, to earth, to give earth a specific shape and expression. And to come back to architecture, we also find haniwa in the shape of old houses. And these buildings, or these haniwa, teach us about how buildings looked like buildings that don't exist anymore. And this also makes us aware that there was an architecture, that there were a lot of buildings and cultures where we have no traces except of these examples, except of these small models that survived in these grave areas. So now think about architecture. We have a lot of castles, we have pyramids, we have big structures in the world, but just think about how much everything is changing. Just try to think about the oldest building in Finland. It's presumably Turku Castle, and we also have Turku Cathedral. So these are in the beginning of 13th century buildings, but it changed so much over time. Just the cathedral was presumably a wooden building in the 13th century and got extended in the 14th and 15th century, became bigger, became more representative, more nice. And here you can see the changes that happened due to the big fire in 1827. You see at the left-hand side that the tower, or the top of the tower, was very different than from what we see today. And you can just imagine, if you go back centuries, that the buildings, or that these buildings looked very, very different in the 14th century, for example. So I would argue nowadays there's not a single building that looks like it looked in the 15th century. What we perceive as an idea of medieval architecture, or as an image of medieval times, for example, it's to large part an illusion. We do not see the medieval buildings. We see how these buildings evolved over time, and we see what these buildings became today. There's an example here for, I don't know how familiar you are with architecture or architectural history. You see I'm slowly drifting in my profession. I stay very shallow on this, but we had always different styles. There was Romanesque architecture. Now I speak in these simple terms. Then we had Gothic architecture. Then Renaissance came. And we have different modes and styles, and buildings changed very much. And it also happens that older styles were regarded as minor, or people forgot about these styles. And then we had Baroque, we had Classicism. And at the end of the 18th century, Gothic architecture was regarded as something minor. It was ugly, it was barbaric. And it happened that people rediscovered these old buildings. There's a treaty by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. He went to Strasbourg. He looks at the cathedral, the Münster in Strasbourg, and he writes a treaty and praises this architecture that is at the same time still being regarded as minor. And then slowly it happens that people rediscover these beautiful medieval buildings. And back then, this is a image, top left, this is St. Albans, this is north of London, and before 1880 and after 1880, and people realized that these buildings are not perfect, they are unfinished, or they are damaged, or they are not maintained very well. And suddenly they try to take care, and what they do is they don't restore the building as we know it today, but it's called restoration back then. But they try to make them perfect, they try to finish them. But what happens is they apply an idea, a 19th century idea of medieval architecture to these buildings. So the buildings on the top left now looks like down right. And if you make a close comparison, you see the tower is still the same, but if you take a close look at the facade, not even the window or so matches. So the buildings are changed very, very much, and you have this with almost every Gothic cathedral or so anywhere. Just if you sometimes you can find old drawings or photographs, and you see how much the architecture was changing and how much people applied their own idea of medieval times to these buildings. This is an oil painting by Carl Friedrich Schinkel. He was a very famous Prussian architect in the beginning of the 19th century, and he was also engaged in painting. And you can see here how he put this recently rediscovered architecture, Gothic architecture, on a very prominent place on the top of the city in a dramatic light situation. And this is for him a symbol of a presumably greater bygone time. People back then thought that Gothic architecture originated in Germany, so Gothic architecture was the epitome, the idea of a great German culture and nation, and people thought, okay, back then in Gothic times, the Holy Roman Empire, the German Empire, had a very strong king and it was on a very high level culturally. It was a golden time. But of course, this is just an exaggeration. Later, it turned out Gothic architecture was invented in France, and times back then were not as good as people thought. And you find this still today. We always, even in politics, you see this. If we refer to presumably better times in the past, we only perceive a little bit of this past, only the part that we select and that we want to see. Okay, I did a lot of research with reconstructions, with authenticity in architecture and what we actually see and how this differs to what used to be there or what we want to see. And I also dived deeply into the World Heritage Sites. I mean, you're all familiar with different World Heritage Sites, but we have the same phenomenon here. I'll show you 4 things. This is Kasubi Tombs in Uganda, the old bridge in Mostar, the old city of Krakow, and a gate at Ejimo in Japan, close to Nara. These are all objects that have been recently rebuilt. The city of Warsaw after its complete destruction in the Second World War, and the other 3 in the 21st century. But they are on the list of World Heritage. These are examples of outstanding universal value because of their craftsmanship, of their beauty, of connections to historical events, etc. But they are just rebuilt. And I think it is okay to rebuild buildings, to create like a one-to-one model of what used to be there or what we still wish would be there. But it also should let us question these objects. So, because we don't actually see the bridge made in medieval times or this tomb from 200 years ago. It's just something that we say fake, or we just rebuild because nowadays we can rebuild everything, and then we have the idea we look into a past, but we completely forgot that this past was destroyed due to failures, due to warfare, due to things that make us human or things we don't want to see within us humans, because we have also an urge to destruction, to warfare, to do bad things. Is there another way to deal with lost things? Is this the only way to reconstruct things? And then we have the 21st century version of a 15th century building, or is there another way? This brings me to the last chapter that I called Silicon. I'm involved with a lot of digitization projects, and I think there's a way to make things, to reconstruct things, architecture, digitally, virtually. We can make beautiful 3D reconstructions, we can use augmented reality, etc. And this is all related in the end to silicon. Silicon is Earth 2. 1/4 of the Earth's crust consists of silicon. So after oxygen, this is the second most abundant material. So here's my connection to Earth, and I take the detour via silicon. I want to introduce you to 2 projects that I'm currently working at, and just to give you an idea of what we are actually nowadays doing with architectural history, how we do apply modern or promising future technologies into something that deals mainly with old objects, with objects that are not existing anymore or are very fragile or that only survive in images. The first project is called Archimedial. It's a project at the University in Delft together with 4 other universities. And we are a team of architectural historians working together with people from IT scientists, computer vision, artificial intelligence, and semantic web. Since roughly 2012, computer vision, or the ability of computers to recognize things, made a big leap forward, and suddenly we are able to achieve things that were unthinkable 20 years ago. You may know this from the face recognition of your phone or from autonomous driving. Computers are already now very good in recognizing things. For this project, we thought about how does a computer look at architecture? If you think, or if you know something about neuronal networks, then you may know that they are the structure of a artificial neuronal network is, or the inspiration was our human brain, and these networks are set up in the way we believe at least our brain is working. So there are also some similarities, and maybe from dealing with computer vision, we can even learn something more about our own brain, because we can at least look a little bit into these networks, but we cannot really look inside our own brain. The first thing is, or the breaking point was for this is we have a lot of images of buildings. We have billions of images, but we have still millions of historical images that shows architecture, and we don't know what's on these images. You can just sometimes, if you don't have a meta tag annotation, nothing. It's just an old photograph, an image of a house. And if there's no description, you're completely lost. So maybe you can say this is presumably a colonial building in Indonesia or a building in Japan, maybe something from Finland. But without precise information, you're lost. And as an architectural historian, you can look at images and you can try to get closer, but it takes a lot of time. And when I talk about these millions of images, it's completely impossible to get closer to it. So we need new technologies to open up this resource for research, because otherwise all these images are lost. And there's so much knowledge contained in these images that we really want to get closer to them, to make use of them, and this is why we apply computers. The first thing what we did is, this project you just see is a screenshot. We had 2 data sets of images of Pittsburgh and Tokyo, and we trained a neural network to distinguish between the cities. We trained the computer with Pittsburgh and with Tokyo, and it resulted in a very high accuracy. Later, you could show an image unknown to the computer, and with a 99% accuracy, the computer can tell you which city it is. But the computer has never seen that image, that particular image before. It learns things about these cities, specific things that we don't know, because we cannot look into these networks precisely. We just see the result. What we did here, we created heat maps. We at least wanted to know which areas the computer is looking at. And you see the red areas is areas where the computer is focusing at. And this is very interesting, because all our thinking, at least our visual thinking, or when I look at a building, is determined linguistically. So I see a roof, I see a window, I see a column, I see structures that I know. And beyond that, it's really, really difficult for me. I do not see, at least I do not actively see, for example, the proportion between a step and a windowsill. So we see these objects, but a computer is very different. A computer looks, for example, at pavements or at the upper end of the first story without focusing on particular elements. And we are still in the process of making sense of it, because it's very difficult, but we are confronted with a completely different view at reality. And this is the same project, but another part of it. I just said we want to make use of historical images. What we're now doing, we found a nice database with 500,000 historical photographs of Amsterdam. Some of these photographs have annotations, so we know the address, but most of them have no annotations. We don't know what's on these, we just know it's Amsterdam. So we could take the pictures, we could walk through the city and identify the buildings. This would take years. What we did is, we trained a neural network with images from Mapillary. This is something like a Google Street View. So the computer is looking at all the Google Street View images of Amsterdam and thereby learning how the city looks like. Later, for example, we have an image like here on the left-hand side, and a black and white historical image, and the computer has never seen that image before, but it can match it to the real situation. It can say, okay, it's most likely that this image, or not the image, the building in the image corresponds to the situation on the right-hand side. And this is very helpful for us, because automatically we can assign hundreds of thousands of images, and we suddenly know what's on this image, and we suddenly know that this building on the right-hand side, for example, had very different windows 50 years ago. So this can help us open up a lot of aspects for research. And of course, we are very familiar with Amsterdam, but we need a playground that is easy for us to go into more difficult things later, say pre-colonial architecture in Indonesia, because if you show this to an architecture historian, most of them get lost because we don't have no knowledge in this architecture. There's something else you can do, and this connects me to the second project. Just imagine you have all these historical images, and now you can extract the facade and put it on the 3D models in the Google Street View. So that means that you can create a street view of the past. If you have a lot of images from, say, the 1950s or 1900, suddenly you can walk, at least virtually, through Amsterdam in the 1950s or 1900, because we can apply the old images to the models. And this is something we work on in the framework of another project with a very humble title, Time Machine. This is a big consortium of, there are 35 founding universities in Europe, and we have 250 partners like the Louvre or a lot of national archives in this project. In Finland, it's Aalto University, University of Helsinki, and the National Archives of Finland. And the idea of this project is actually to build a virtual time machine. We, in this consortium, applied for a funding. It's called an FET flagship, Future and Emerging Technologies. This is the most valuable funding instrument of the European Union. So there's a call for a project on a 10-year cycle, so it's a duration of 10 years, and it's proposed to fund this project with 1 billion euro. So we are in the last round of competition now, and we are the project with the highest ranking profile. And now in this last round, the European Commission said that they want to change this type of grant, and now it's very unknown what is the outcome, if this money will be available or not. So it's a bit disappointing to be at this point. But we are sure, because we have so many partners and major cultural players from Europe, that this project will go on in, we don't know what way exactly, but there will something will be happening. Okay, what it is about. 6 years ago, it already started in Venice, called the Venice Time Machine. If you Google it, you also find TED Talks and very interesting things about this. Venice has very complete city archives. There are 80 kilometers of archival records. So just go into an archive and try to manage 1 meter of archival records. It takes quite a while, so 80 kilometers is unachievable. Most of these things have never been looked at by human beings. Nowadays, we have very, very good scanning technologies. Yeah, we can make scans like on a conveyor belt. So this is ongoing. The whole archive is being scanned now. And there are even scanners that can scan closed books, like medieval manuscripts are very fragile. So when you turn the pages, it's really not good for the book to open it, to turn the pages. But the layer of oxygen between the pages is thick enough to make a scanner distinguish between the pages. And also the recognition of handwriting also made big advantages, or big leaps forwards. So nowadays it is technically possible to scan a closed book and even to decipher the handwriting in the book. So of course it takes time and it's very expensive, it takes a lot of money, but it is now going on just the beginning. Just think 10, 20 years ahead what we can do then. So the whole archive is being scanned, and now the project, the European Time Machine project, the idea is to do the same thing for all over Europe. So this is, of course, large scale, and this is very expensive, but this is the future vision. This is the number one resource of Europe. It's culture and it's arts, and it's so rich. We should make use of it. And the great thing is, now imagine you go to an archive, you see somewhere you have a church register, you see the name of a person, and you see the birth date and the date this person died. If a computer knows all the archival records and puts them into a knowledge graph, it can make connections to all the records where this same name appears. Suddenly, you can make connections with this one name to, say, the cadastral register, to the business register. You get a complete picture of this person. At least you can refer to everything that's still existing in records. You see networks, you see how things come together. So this gives us a completely different idea of history. This is just a tool. We still have to make sense of it on our own, but it helps us very, very much to get connections, to see how it all worked. And our part from architecture history is to make sense of the documents related to architecture, of city plans, of floor plans, of maps, of paintings, of facades, and then we can use this, we can bring it together, and we can automatically reconstruct virtually how a city at a specific point of time looked like, given that we have the information, or the information in records is still existing. This is a nice collage. You see the photograph on the right-hand side, the painting on the left-hand side. It just gives you an idea how we envision that one day we can virtually slide through history and see things and connect things that now are not it's just not feasible for us or not possible for us to do. Okay, this is the end. I just wanted to talk about digitization as an idea of how we can eventually turn everything into Earth, into silicon, into organized Earth, and how we can kind of escape the natural cycle of decay that is so closely embedded with the element of Earth. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your engaging lecture, which had so many elements. I don't know where we should start, but any questions or comments from the audience? Okay, I think here is the first eager question.
Thank you, that was riveting, and indeed, the wealth of material in your talk was astounding. And thank you for bringing attention to Musashi's work and the Book of Five Rings, because it's kind of basis on what we do for the next 5 years. I have a couple of comments for that, which might be trivial, but I'm building towards a question there. So first one is the elusiveness of Japanese language, which is, we have 2 different translations of the book in Finnish, and the second one was done by a swordmaster from Nitenichi Ryu, the actual school of Musashi. So that was more precisely, especially, you mentioned that it's hard to kind of make sense of the book, the content, it's elusive as well, and it's you can kind of interpret it in very many directions. So here is a swordmaster actually going through the very particular meanings that Musashi would have implemented towards the art of the ken, the sword itself. So there is this kind of more precise, and then there's more philosophical and kind of heuristic reading of the book, where you can kind of apply it to all directions of life, including the businesses and arts and so on. So that was the first one. About the fight with Sasaki Kojiro, a couple of more details, because you mentioned that Musashi would use everything. The reason why he carved the sword from the rudder or the oar of the boat was because Sasaki Kojiro had this very famous long sword, which was called a drying pole, because it was so long. So Musashi needed to have something to overcome the length of the sword. So to do it from, the wood was just something that he could do a longer sword, so he would able to reach longer. And then another thing is that he approached from the sea to the island of Ganryu, and the idea was that he was coming from the side of where the sun would be shining behind his back, so he got another advantage through that. So just an example of the strategic thinking that would permit all possible conditions there in the fight. Then the third one, approaching the question. Musashi lived in a point where Japanese, you mentioned the idea the shogunate came, the Tokugawa or Edo period started, and there was a long period of peace. And what happened is that samurai kind of, in a way, when there's no war, what does a warrior do? And the question of this kind of no-nonsense of the katana, the sword, the kind of most precise killing machine of that time maybe, they became more decorative, and there would be carvings in the swords as well. They became works of art, and of course the sword was kind of the soul of the samurai in a way. So, and also the fighting arts became more and more detailed, and you would get different ranking systems and scrolls of kind of knowledge about different fighting techniques, and you would have more techniques. So more techniques, more decorations, less no-nonsense. You get the point. So the question would be, as this kind of expert of architecture, would this be also visible in the architectural styles? That would they also become more like decorative and polished? Then we approach the Meiji Restoration and the westernization of the Japanese society. But was this reflected the same way in the all areas of Japanese life, maybe?
I see these like simplicity or abundance of decoration also in the Japanese, in the historical, and even nowadays in the architecture. There's a very famous little drawing by Bruno Taut. It was a German architect who went to Japan in the beginning of the 20th century. He was very fascinated by the Japanese architecture, and he tried to put exactly this into a little sketch and a diagram. And his starting point is there's a shrine called Ise Shrine in Japan, and this is a very specific building. It houses a sacred mirror, and it goes really straight back to Japanese deities. And the specific thing is with this building, since 1,500 years, it is rebuilt every 20 years. So every 20 years, the shrine, and it's a lot of buildings that this area is being replaced. But this architecture is very, very pure. Yeah? You have this pure cedar wood. There's no painting on it, it's just pure wood. And then you have these, how you call this, the skin of a tree? Like the thing around the tree, you know what I mean? So there are these little shingles of this is on the roof, and it's a very beautiful building. Borg, yeah, exactly, yeah, works. There's not much decoration except of some little golden parts, but it's very simple and refined. And for Taut, this was the starting point of Japanese architecture in a way. And then if you go, for example, to Nikko, it is a place north of Tokyo, you find a lot of religious buildings there, and it's very colorful, and you see carvings influenced from China over Buddhism with dragons, and it's completely different. And so Taut is arguing with this purity, and that that he sees these different influences that merge into something later. But I think this is every culture, especially Japanese culture, is influenced by different things. The Ise Shrine goes back to Shinto, and then you have Buddhism coming from the outside. You had a short phase where Christians came and were sent away. But you see these, it's a mixture of different elements. And even nowadays, and this is so fascinating for me in Japan, that you see these contrasts. On the one hand side, it can be so quiet and focus on harmony, and suddenly it's so loud and neon and screaming and colors, but it belongs together. It's one, yeah. And I don't know what is. I think for me, an object that is very pure and simple has more fascination. I don't know why, but I would not argue that this is better or so. I would not say that a modernist building is in any way better than a Baroque church or so. Not the other way around. These are different expressions of our taste, of our creativity, of our influences. And yeah, a lot of art historians, they argued that you had, with the different phases of style, you had, I don't know, early time of Gothic architecture, then High Gothic, and then you always have this, in the end, a phase of mannerism or so, when it becomes too much and eventually moves into something else. I think this is more an old school way of writing aesthetic history. I don't think that this actually applies. Things are changing. If a katana would stay the same for 600 years, it would just be boring. So you have to apply new forms, new shapes, adapt it to your own time, and turn it into something that makes sense again and can inspire new things. At least how I see it.
If I can ask myself a follow-up question on Musashi, because about kind of cultural encounters and translations, maybe. I don't know if you're able to answer, but if you can kind of speculate a bit on it. But I was just wondering who has actually been translating them, and as the texts have been used, it's always said that they have been used in the context of kind of business and that. But I actually know people from kind of cultural fields that are reading him. I was just wondering, are there kind of national and cultural different contexts that he's been read in Europe, or how did you find him?
That's a very good question. I absolutely cannot answer this. I have no idea, because there are a lot of different translations in English, at least. And I mean, it's 350 years old, so you have older translations, newer ones, and then we have so many translations in other languages, even 2 into Finnish, which it's already a lot. So, and then you have, I don't know, 20 or 50 in English, and I don't know who the people were being fascinated by Musashi, and I don't know who is reading this book, but you come across that it's used for business strategy. When I was in Japan, we had a big university library, And I had a good friend there in Japan. He was also very fascinated by Japanese literature. We just made our way through things we believed to be classics or important for Japanese literature, and we read some of these things. And this book was one of these. Yeah.
Okay, maybe we can speculate more on that later. Any other questions, comments?
You spent quite a long time on your appreciation of that weapon, its flexibility, the sword, I mean, flexibility and sharpness and aesthetics of it. When you compare that type of object with brutal ugliness of present weapons, like if you think of a parade of Russian power, and they have these mass destruction weapons on display, they are not to, they are just to display the power. They are not to display aesthetics. Mm-hmm. Now, I have no idea about these Japanese weapons, but is it this duel you speak about? Is the goal to kill? When he had a duel with this opponent, is the aim to kill?
Yeah.
Or destroy his weapon? That's what I know.
I think the Musashi, I think, would have said that the aim is to win, but this means that the aim is to kill your opponent. So this is the only way of winning. It's not the goal to destroy the weapon or so. It's just
okay. That was my question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but you're right. This is I did not want to glorify a weapon in that sense, or to say that these are great objects or so. But I just wanted to take an object and then just to dive into it's more for me the refinement of if you see it as an artwork, if you don't see the purpose, so I can really appreciate it. But like the military parades or so, this is something that I cannot see any aesthetic thing into it, but we can have different opinions.
Thank you.
The word silicon, and then I was just thinking, like, Musashi lived in a period of transition, so do we, and the AI is coming obviously now, and with incredible results as we can perceive. Mm-hmm. My mind was blown by the idea of scanning the books, that are closed.
Yeah.
But this brought me to the idea of nanotechnology and intelligent materials, and how the whole idea of Earth is transformed through that thought. How everything that surrounds us might start to think in a way, like, of course, it doesn't really think, mm-hmm. and at least yet, it's not self-aware or singular or whatever mm-hmm. the transhumanist would be talking about. But I was just thinking that in this world of incredible increased knowledge and perfection of digital, Japanese talked about the imperfection in Tsuba, for example. Is the human being the imperfect element in this new aesthetic revolution?
I don't want to say it like that, but I recently read I think most of you also read this famous book by Yuval Harari, the Homo Deus, and then there's a book by John Lovelock called Novacene, and he talks about the coming age of superintelligence. And if you follow the argumentations just without emotion or so, just what seems to be logical, what is happening, within a rather short time, we will have machines that are so super intelligent, it's way beyond what we can ever imagine. But it's just, but this is just intelligence. It's not emotion. It's not. There's no nothing more. It's just very cold and pure so far. And I think for us, for human beings, we cannot deal with this to a maximum amount. We still need imperfections. We need human relations, and etc. But in both books, the argument is that within the next couple of 100 years, we may overcome, how can I say, humanship or so. Yeah, both authors argue that we are at a moment of change, because if you think about digital technology and just how much happened in the last just 50 years or so, it's completely impossible to think ahead for 50 years or 100 years. So therefore it's also a question, maybe it's interesting to reflect on it, but we should be careful, because we just can't know what will be happening in 20, 30, 40 years in that sense. So I think we need to be open and to be careful, maybe to try to have a little influence on to where this direction is going. But we're kind of powerless in that sense, maybe.
I want to go back to the sword, and partly also relating to your question about the human being as the imperfect part of the unity between the human being and the sword, perhaps. The sword, you talked about its perfection, its beauty, and it's also something that is mythicized and mythicalized in Western popular culture. If you think about Kill Bill, for example, so it's very obvious that the sword is something, and it's an absolutely fantastic, perfect killing machine, as was also mentioned. Yeah, exactly. Yep. And so what about these samurais or the
Ronin? Yeah.
Yes, I just remember Ronin from Stargate. Yeah. So Atlantis, a similar kind of figure in a sense. So my question actually is very, very simple. So why were these samurais, wandering samurais, doing their job? Did they do it for the money or for some ethical reasons? What about the moral issue of killing for honor? So it's also a very masculinist culture, it seems.
If you see this as masculine items, it is very difficult. This is a long time ago. It is a very, very different society, a very, very different culture. Or even now just think about the, maybe stupid example, but Second World War and in Japan, and also the kamikaze fighters and people who sacrifice their life. So there is maybe for some people, due to educational culture, they have a very specific idea of honor. Yeah? And the ultimate honor is that you sacrifice your life for something. For example, for the samurai, it was when their lord also died. So they should or could commit a seppuku, this ritual suicide when they cut their stomach, and this is also considered as an honorable way of dying. So I don't want to die like that myself, so I don't care about that honor. But for some people, this is really, really important. And if you grow up like this, it's that the gentleman or the warrior is the highest rank in the Japanese society. You grow up with a lot of ideas of honor, of things we are completely unfamiliar with, and things that we can hardly, retrace or feel or understand. And I cannot understand why it is the greatest honor to sacrifice your life. But I think we always should be open a little bit to these completely different understandings of the world. And I find that difficult, but I think for these people it must have been absolutely real. Otherwise they wouldn't have done it. So, but it's a difficult idea, difficult to understand, and difficult to get into this situation.
And it seems it's also very fascinating, because it's something that here in the West we relate to in very specific ways we can't understand, but at the same time we mythicalize that, and we sort of get fascinated by
True, but
by
also, I
the
mean,
kind of
we
idea.
also had these duels, yeah. Even later with pistols or so, people were engaging in these duels, and out of reasons of honor. I don't know what it was about, fighting for women or something, you know. And people then shot each other, or even before the knights and the knights in the rivalry, when they were on the horses with this long beam of wood, kicking each other from the horse. It's just so horrible just to think about it. But people engaged in these things, and they took it very serious, and they were committed to do it. And yeah, times are changing, and our perception of the world is changing completely with these times, and things are very difficult sometimes.
So perhaps we can now pursue the question of what is the contemporary duel in that case? What do we do for honor?
Climate change, you know, world politics. We have so many duels on a large scale. We're not fighting each other maybe anymore, but if you just look at what's going on in the world, there's a lot of attempts to kill ourselves and each other. So yeah, there's a lot of crazy things that are going on, maybe even worse than back then when just two people decided to harm each other and no one else.
Yes, I think maybe one can read Musashi. I didn't read it completely, I just started reading it. But from what you said, maybe one can use the strategy in the coming times to not to win over an opponent, but to win over people, to pull them to your side and to team up with them.
Good point, but this is something Musashi did not think about. But yeah, essentially it's a good point how you can, why should you fight each other when you can convince each other to make something like, yeah, that's maybe dialectics or so. Huh? You have one idea or position and your opponent, and you should always see how you can come together and make something more out of it than just convince the other of your idea. So, but yeah, you don't really see people doing that. That's strange.
A short comment on the transformation of the fighting arts. I do Aikido, and we had a session in Aboagora last year, and the idea of transforming something that was art of killing into something art of love or compassion, or showing the meaninglessness of violence, which is kind of at the heart of this particular martial art, relates also to the larger transformation of Japanese fighting arts from jutsu, which is the way of the skill of killing or wounding or whatever, dislocating an arm, to do, a road, a path, where the honor transforms into self-discipline and respect towards your fellow beings, and this kind of code of living ethically and purely. So that's one of the ways that Japanese have been reasoning, and which is part of the why it's still kind of reflecting a lot of Westerners also do this art. So there's this kind of idea of self-perfection through training, not to kill other people, but to be able not to do it as well.
Hey, thanks so much for the very rich lecture, and maybe because I think it's really interesting conversation around the weapon, and thanks actually to this really engaging description of the making of the sword, almost is as if we could see it. I would just like to bring in the kind of the very interesting, because working iron is mythical in so many places around the world, and in pre-modern, I mean back to prehistory, and it is actually probably the first earth element being worked, and so the mythologies around metallurgy are extremely fascinating. But I think it's very interesting to see how this power that comes from the sky, actually, because first iron being worked is meteorite iron, the pure iron. So for the very first metallurgists, it really was this object that they saw coming down, and so it's incredible also the power of this idea, also that it's really from there, this fire, from above, from elsewhere. But yeah, since the beginnings of metallurgy, I think the idea of knife, that's instead of a sword, that it's a tool and a weapon, it already opens up somehow. It leads us straight down to this moment where actually every technology we talk about is always can be used or goes both ways. So any single thing we can talk about, which is high tech or green tech, always goes many ways. And I'm very interested in that. And also this came a bit through a presentation. So thanks so much. But also really how important there is the gender surrounding it historically, but also today in different types of technologies, but in metallurgy especially. Not all metallurgists were men, but they were all the symbols that are genderized. And of course the weapon carries with its strong masculinity as well. But then the knife also doesn't need to be actually. How it's being used as a tool, etc. So yeah, just maybe a comment. Thanks for bringing all this. Really, it was very strong and present.
Thank you for listening so well. Metallurgy, in the preparation, I'm fascinated by you. Sometimes you find these etches or so about from Bruegel or so, when people see engaged in alchemy. And you see a laboratory, I don't know, a 16th century laboratory, and people heating up things and mixing it together. And this is also, I find this also very fascinating, that the people tried for centuries to turn metal into gold. Yeah, this was a goal of science, and that for a large part they did not really knew what they were doing. So, and I also wonder if a couple of 100 years from now we look back at our times, and people may also think it's so strange what they understand as a science, and how they're trying to make things, and what we now know better. And yeah, it helps sometimes to look into history to also understand about ourselves and about our things that we not fully understand yet, and in the future may see different.